The medium of radio has been around for a long time now, and throughout its history, it has done much to capture the hearts and minds of listeners the world over. Whether it be the now legendary broadcast of The War of the Worlds by Orson Welles, or the rise and dominance of shock jocks like Howard Stern, radio can be a powerful cultural force. In many ways, radio paved the way for the world of podcasts we all consume and enjoy today, among many other things. The contributions of radio to culture cannot be overstated. Through the sheer amount of radio broadcasts throughout the decades, a number of gimmicks, tropes, and themes show up. One of these gimmicks that I would easily consider my favorite across the radio medium is the famous call-in. Now, radio interviews are nothing new, and many radio stations, especially talk radio, use this style to varying degrees. One such station that leaned heavy on these interviews to provide listeners with a next-level, in-depth discussion was Coast to Coast AM, created and for a long time hosted by the late, the great Art Bell. Of all the calls, interviews, and debates held on this broadcast, there is one particular caller that stands out to me beyond everything else, that being the enigmatic Area 51 caller. Let's dive in and explore this particular radio call, and discover why, exactly, it may very well be the greatest radio call of all time, and just how captivating it was for not just Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM, but listeners and fans alike. The story of Coast to Coast AM is intrinsically intertwined with the story of Art Bell, the station's creator. Bell's journey through radio began all the way back in the 1960s, while Bell was serving in the military, specifically the United States Air Force. While stationed at Amarillo Air Force Base, Bell would start a pirate radio station that would play music for members stationed at the base. This would mark the launch of Bell's career in radio broadcasting. The pirate station grew so large that it would be rated on the Arbitron, the study that analyzed the popularity of specific radio stations, and the signal was strong enough that it pulled listeners all the way in nearby Amarillo. Once he left the service in 1966, Art Bell would continue to capitalize on his skills as a radio broadcaster at several different stations before finding himself working in Okinawa, Japan, at the only English radio station in the country, KSBK. Here, Bell would also set a Guinness World Record at this station for the longest straight broadcast when he stayed live on the air for 5 days and 5 nights, totaling 115 hours and 15 minutes. It's clear that by this time, Mr. Bell found his true calling and he was already poised for a successful career in radio broadcasting. After his tenure at KSBK in Japan, Art Bell would return to the United States and would soon have his first real taste of radio politics. In 1975, he would hear of the Amerasian children stranded in Saigon after the Americans had pulled out of Vietnam. Feeling inspired to do something about it, he began discussing the issue on a radio show he was working at in Anchorage, Alaska. As he continued to speak about the issue, donations from listeners would begin rolling in, allowing them to charter a Douglas DC-8 to fly to Saigon and return 120 of these orphans to America, and have them adopted by American families. This was one of Art Bell's most cherished moments in his career, and it seems that he had a knack too for political talk radio. As his career pressed onward with minor changes, he would briefly branch out to jobs in television broadcasting. In 1986, Bell would return to radio when 50,000-watt KDWN radio in Las Vegas would offer him a 5-hour time slot in the middle of the night at their station. At KDWN, Bell's show would be the roots of what we know today as Coast to Coast AM, known initially as West Coast AM. With Bell as the host, it operated as a political call-in show discussing a vast array of political topics and issues of the time. Eventually, in 1988, Art Bell and Alan Corbett would rename the show to the name we all know it as today, Coast to Coast AM. It was on this show that Bell would shift from conventional political talk to other political topics like gun control and many different conspiracy theories. In the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, fears surrounding being labeled an anti-government activist would force the hand of many radio broadcasters, and Art Bell was not immune to this fear. And so, as a response to this, the next big shift in Bell's content would see him venturing into the worlds of the paranormal, the occult, and pseudoscience. Thankfully, this shift proved wildly successful for Coast to Coast AM. This new type of content is also where Art Bell would really start to build his legacy and resonate even further with his audience. In a sense, these discussions became what Bell was known for, and to be honest, he does these topics great justice and shows off just how amazing of an entertainer he really is. This is also where, coincidentally, the main topic of this video would surface and history would be made. Having built his newfound reputation with conspiracy theories and pseudoscience, Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM attracted all sorts of zany personalities. While the show is not exclusive to these topics, it certainly was the main focus. Keep in mind, this was in the 90s, long before Alex Jones would develop his reputation for conspiracy. It was a different era for radio, and Art Bell was at the forefront of this growing type of content. It was one fateful night in September 1997 that during his regular broadcast, Art Bell would receive perhaps the greatest call-in of his career. An unknown man called in to the show purporting to be an ex-Area 51 employee, and what he had to tell the world was staggering, not to mention convincing. I'll show you the clip, but beforehand let's do a quick summary. On September 11th, ironically enough, a man would call into Coast to Coast AM, and what he had to tell the world, and specifically Art Bell, was absolutely wild. But it's not immediately clear whether this call was a hoax or not, and given this man's performance throughout the call, it has an eerie ring of truth. The caller goes on to describe an alien conspiracy surrounding Area 51 and notes that what we think of as aliens was untrue, and that the aliens he was talking about were actually what he called extra-dimensional beings. The conspiracy continues as the man discusses that these aliens have penetrated our military establishments and governments, and all of this is culminating in a takeover of our world through force and eventual enslavement for the remaining human beings. I've mentioned this caller's particular performance and how convincing it really is, but that was only the start of this weirdness throughout this call. Eventually, the call would disconnect seemingly out of nowhere as Art Bell lost connection to his satellite for about 20 minutes in the middle of the call. Through his efforts, Bell would bring the broadcast back on the air, but by this time the caller had disappeared into the ether. At the end of it all, even Bell seems a little uneasy over the information that was just dumped into his ear holes. Now let's give this full call a listen. Here we go.
Line, you're on the air. Hello.
Hello, Art.
Yes.
Hi. I don't have a whole lot of time.
Well, look, let's begin by finding out whether you're using this line properly or not.
Area 51.
Yeah, that's right. Were you an employee or are you now?
A former employee.
Former employee.
I was let go on a medical discharge about a week ago, and I've kind of been running across the country. Oh man, I don't know where to start. They're gonna they'll triangulate on this position really soon.
So you can't spend a lot of time on the phone. So give us something quick.
Okay. Okay. What we're thinking of as aliens, Art, they're extra-dimensional beings that an earlier precursor of the space program made contact with. They are not what they claim to be. They have infiltrated a lot of aspects of the military establishment, particularly the Area 51. The disasters that are coming, the military, the government knows about them, and there's a lot of safe areas in this world that they could begin moving the population to now, Art.
But they're not doing anything.
They are not. They want the major population centers wiped out so that the few that are left will be more easily controllable.
Discharge.
I started getting...
Some way, something knocked us off the air, and we're on a backup system now.
It's the government, or...
I don't know.
It has to be something, though.
Well, did you hear? Now, you tell me because you were listening.
That was awful strange.
There was a really weird guy on the air when it went off?
Yeah, real weird out.
Like going sort of sounding paranoid, schizophrenic?
Like crying and everything.
Yeah. And how far into the conversation was it when it went off?
Just a couple, about 15, 20 seconds, I'd say.
Oh, you guys you really missed the call then, and I've got a feeling somebody didn't want you to hear it.
How creepy is that? At first listen, it's easy to shrug off the caller as a paranoid schizophrenic, having a meltdown. That is, right up until the call disconnects out of nowhere and shuts down the broadcast for 20 minutes. Having warned Bell at the beginning of the call about someone triangulating his position, the caller was seemingly convinced that this would be the outcome the entire time, and judging by his voice, he was filled with utter terror about it. Whether this was a performance or not, it is one of the most convincing audio tapes I've ever heard. If the broadcast hadn't been shut down, it would easily cast this call as a clear hoax, but the shutting down of the station would flip the whole script on its head. And given the fact that it was unexpected on Bell's part, so he claims, may validate everything the guy was saying the whole time. Of course, we'll never know specifically, but man, is it fun to speculate. This isn't the end of our crazy call-in saga, however, and the story would generate much for the legendary broadcaster, as Bell would occasionally harken back to this call. Thankfully, it will live on in the minds of those listening that day, and even reach new audiences, particularly on YouTube. Furthermore, the saga would continue when another man would call in months later. A few months later, in the following year, another call would take place, on April 28, 1998. A man claiming to be the same guy who made the initial call would call back in to Coast AM, and seemingly Art Bell would get to discuss matters with the guy once again. The man who called in this time gave us his name, allegedly Brian, and he wanted to clear up some things. This time around in the second call, Brian takes responsibility for the crazy happenings back in September of the year previous. Only this second call was basically to dismiss the spiraling response by confessing the first call as a well-thought-out hoax. The second caller's voice does indeed have some resemblance to the initial caller, but considering it's all on live radio, it's incredibly hard to sort out the facts. Of course, it's always up for you to decide, and if I were to throw my 2 cents in, I do believe it's the same guy. And this whole saga really showcases the talent of both the caller and especially Art Bell. Anyway, before we get too deep on the second call, let's give it a listen so you can see and hear exactly what I'm talking about.
East of the Rockies, you're on the air.
Hi, Art. This is Brian.
Hi, Brian.
Hello. You didn't disconnect me before, did you?
Were you on earlier tonight?
No, not, towards the end of the last hour, you said, East of the Rockies, you're on the air, and your voice was immediately replaced by the operator saying, your party has not connected.
Oh, well, see, as you can now tell, I don't screen calls. So
Right.
What happened, obviously, was that I answered the phone just at the very instant that you had been ringing as long as they were going to let you ring.
Yeah.
And so that occurs, obviously, sometimes I go to a line and it's dead and nobody's there, and that's what's happened. You know, we just were on the cusp there. Anyway, I'm glad you made it back through.
Yeah, you got all my paranoia buttons running. I always get very nervous when I call you. I'm Brian. I hung up on you last week.
Oh, I see.
And I just figured, damn the torpedoes. I'll just do this and let the chips fall where they will.
All right.
Everybody, I am the Area 51 caller. That's my statement, and let you or whatever tear it apart.
You claim you're the Area 51?
I am the man.
How do you account for the fact, Area 51 caller,
Okay.
that part of the way through your spiel, the satellite went down?
I have no idea, and it scared the heebie-jeebies out of me that night. I've called a number of times on your specialty line nights doing different, kind of wacky characters, and that's all that one was supposed to be. And if the call had been completed, it would have been ancient history by now.
Has it occurred to you, as Barbara Marks Hubbard suggested tonight, that perhaps, if you're really what you say you are, you created the reality of the rest of the situation and took down my satellite.
That scares the heebie-jeebies out of me because it means that what I was saying was somehow correct, and it was fabrication kind of
creating a reality.
Yeah, if that was the case, I humbly apologize to you because I love your show, and the last thing I would ever want to do is
knock me off the air.
So what can I do to prove my claim here?
Well, I guess you could give us a little of what you gave us then so that we could hear it and know it to be you.
Are you sure you want me to do that, Art?
I'm positive.
Don't, Art, please. I don't want you to ask me to do this. If I start doing that guy,
let's just take that little sample that you just gave us so that we don't alter some sort of hard little reality here at the end of the program, and we'll let the callers be the judge.
Okay.
All right?
I thank you for this opportunity. This has just been driving me bananas for months, and I didn't know what you wanted me to do. I knew it was very difficult for me to prove to you. But I just thank you for your patience in dealing with me up to this time.
All right, it's quite all right. Thank you. Fritz in Phoenix, as a matter of fact, called and said, oh, yes, that's him.
Just like the call disconnecting during the September call, the follow-up call throws a huge wrench in the whole Area 51 caller saga. The voice is definitely similar, but there does seem to be some difference. However, the frantic disposition of the first caller compared to the calmness of the second makes it difficult to really conclude whether it is in fact the same man. Like I said, I believe that Brian is the same guy in the second call, but really it is hard to tell 100%. However, in regards to the whole story, the second call raises a few questions. 1. Why did he wait so long to call back in and clarify? Maybe he really was going through a prolonged mental health episode, and the time between certainly gave Brian the chance to practice his performance to make it seem that he really is the same guy. Secondly, he is implicated in taking down Bell's satellite and quickly covers it up by saying that his fabrication became reality, which is pretty out there. I mean, if he did make the whole thing up, it would have to be reasonably informed to guess the entire right thing, stoking the ire of the powers that be to shut down the satellite. It's all just completely out there. Given that Coast to Coast AM was heavily focused on conspiracy at this point and its legacy, surely the fan base was too. It's important to understand that as you look through particularly the YouTube comments on these calls, as many have even more claims and interpretations to add to the fire. The first of many centers around an idea where the second caller is not the same man, and it's actually an agent working to dispel the fervor of the response. These folks believe that likely the first man is dead due to what he confessed on Art Bell's broadcast, and that the second call is a lie used to tone down the efficacy of the first one. This interpretation overlaps with others too. Many believe it is actually the same man in the second call, however, argue that he got, so to speak, and is being forced to cover his tracks. Either way, the conspiracies on this one run deep, as you could imagine. Given that there's little information beyond the context of these two calls, I'll let you guys be the judge. Was Brian telling the truth in the first call? Let me know in the comments. After the second call, Coast to Coast AM was met with radio silence from Brian. This is sadly the end of our tale of radio's greatest call-in. Unfortunately, there are little answers as to the fate of Brian, whether or not he was telling the truth on the first call, or even if he was suffering from sort of a mental breakdown or something. And as there are only these two calls to go by, was it all just BS? Occam's razor suggests that it is all made up, an act, theater. What we do have, though, is an amazing story, especially for those interested in conspiracies or fans of Coast to Coast AM. This call also showcases Art Bell's pure talent as an entertainer. Bell, of course, has a long history of calls akin to this one, interviews with various personalities, and in every one he exemplifies himself as a Tier 1 entertainer. But what's more is that this specific call would inspire at least two music artists, those being Tool and The Faceless. They both include parts of the call where Brian is laying it all out. Tool included it in their song Fight Doyad, and The Faceless used it throughout the song Planetary Duality, 1, Hideous Revelation. These two songs are great in and of themselves, but with the inclusion of Brian's call, it shows that this call-in has created a legacy. Art Bell, one of radio's greatest personalities of all time, would go on to have a lengthy career through Coast to Coast AM, and sadly would eventually pass in 2018. Thankfully, he left us with so much to entertain us and inspire us, and most importantly, he gave us a legendary saga of radio's greatest call-in, the Area 51 guy, Brian.